Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism's Asian Religion series. In this series, we will be discussing religious traditions in Asia other than Buddhism. Buddhism never existed in a vacuum, and as it has spread all across East Asia, it is developed, localized, and syncretized with local traditions in fascinating and significant ways. As such, we can't provide a complete picture of East Asian Buddhism without discussing these local traditions such as they were and such as they are. Today, we'll be continuing our discussion of Daoism, a very historically and culturally significant tradition originating in China. We hope you enjoy. Having discussed a little bit about how Daoism is presented textually in the previous episode, I wanted to spend this episode discussing the three different modes or domains in which Daoism existed as a social force in Chinese history. These are the philosophical, the religious, and the political. Importantly, you should note that these three categories have tons of overlap, and nobody in history would ever say, I'm a political Daoist, but that guy over there is a religious Daoist. They wouldn't even say they were Daoists. These categories are impositions made by scholars in the modern era, and the role that Daoism played in real life on a day-to-day basis was a mixture of all three of these modes and even more than just these three. So as a result, we should keep in mind that scholars put Daoism into these categories descriptively, and they don't represent anything prescriptive. They're not the only modes either, like I said, but they are useful for thinking of the different roles Daoism has played throughout history. A strong analog would be thinking about Christianity's roles in philosophy, religion, and politics, respectively. Christianity presents a philosophy of metaphysics, of time, of ethics, and more. Christianity also has religious practices like prayer, sacraments, Bible study, and other rituals. Christianity also informs a political platform for those who want to legislate morality according to the Bible, or at least their version of it. Similarly, historical Daoism presented a philosophy of the universe, of time, and of ethics, and it had religious practices for the sake of achieving immortality, and people who practiced the Tao thought that government should accord with their version of what practicing the Tao means. So, let's begin our discussion with philosophical Daoism. We discussed this a little bit in the previous episode when we discussed the Daodejing, but we will flesh out our discussion more here. Philosophical Daoism is the tradition of textual debate on the nature and significance of the Tao that took place in Chinese history. The Daodejing is one of these texts, but there are more, such as the Zhuangzi, the Mozi, the Wenzi, the I Ching, the Liezi, the Legge, and many more. Today, we are going to really sit with the Daodejing and the Zhuangzi, but you should also be aware that we are undoubtedly going to see influences pulled in from other texts as well. As I've mentioned before, this stage of Chinese history represents an entire ecosystem of philosophical, religious, and political textual traditions. So, let's look at how the Zhuangzi presents reality, ethics, and personhood in relation to the concept of the Tao. This will just be a cursory look because, of course, this text is very long and has many translations, but hopefully this discussion will at least present the overall shape of how debates unfolded in Daoism as a textual tradition. As we mentioned, the Daodejing presents this idea that the Tao is the natural pattern or mode of the unfolding of the universe, and that this state is the best way to live from a moral point of view. This state is a state of wu wei, or non-action, and unfolds by means of ziran, or spontaneous emergence. To return to this primordial ideal state, you must unknow everything you have learned in what we might now call a rewilding process in a modern and Western context. You must unlearn civilization, philosophy, habit, and even in some cases, language, because the Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao. This is a million-mile-an-hour summary of a very interesting and complicated text, but from this, we can see that the Daodejing romanticizes nature to a great degree. Untouched nature where human beings have not constructed any villages or towns or habitations are thought to be places where one can come closest to the uninterrupted unfolding of the Tao. Other than saying one must unlearn and one must return to the primordial and baby-like state of softness and naturalness, the Daodejing does not present very much regarding ethics. For example, while it presents the Tao as a moral ideal, it does not readily deal with the problem of the moral status of murder and killing. For more detail on what the Daodejing actually says, you can check back to the last episode, and you can also look into the text itself. Complicated as it is, it's a fairly easy read in translation. Now, let's talk about the Zhuangzi. This is a text authored by a single author who we are kinda sure existed, as opposed to Lao-tzu, the author and compiler of the Daodejing, who is thought to be an amalgam of many different authors and compilers. The author of the Zhuangzi, or at least a majority of it, was named Zhuangzhou, or Zhuangzi, which means Master Zhuang, and he lived in around the 4th century BCE, or the Warring States period of Chinese history. For reference, Confucius was said to have lived from 551 BCE through 479 BCE, so Zhuangzi came up a bit later compared to Confucius. The only records we have of his life come from some portions of the Zhuangzi itself and from other commentaries and texts associated with the Zhuangzi later in history, so it's possible that, like Lao-tzu, Zhuangzi, or Master Zhuang, did not exist as a single historical person. However, that is less likely than the alternative, which is that he was a person and that much of what we have about him is true. A major source for Zhuangzi's life is Sima Qian's history, called Records of the Grand Historian, which historians date to 91 BCE, about 300 years after the life of Zhuangzi himself. In Sima's history, Zhuangzhou is described as a low-ranking government official from the town of Meng, in modern-day Anhui province, in the state of Song. Not much of his life is important for understanding the Zhuangzi text, but we can assume that he was well-educated and had some material wealth. Now let's talk about the Zhuangzi text. The Zhuangzi consists of stories and short passages that purport to describe or exemplify the ideal religious/philosophical Taoist sage. This is where things get tricky. The text presents some very crucial moral points for how to live, making it a moral text, but it also presents maxims for how to approach thinking about living and life, which makes it very existential in a way. These categories already transcend the three modes of philosophy, religion, and politics that we described before, so keep that in mind. However, this text marks an entry in the tradition of philosophical Taoism because it is a compilation of writings pertaining to the Tao and how to live in relation to it. It contains anecdotes, allegories, parables, and fables that are frequently humorous. The most famous anecdote in the text is the butterfly dream. For context, this is a passage where the author describes Zhuangzhou falling asleep and dreaming he was a butterfly, and then waking up and questioning if the butterfly dream was actually a dream or if waking life as a human being was a dream. The passage reads, quote, "Once Zhuangzhou dreamed he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering about, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know that he was Zhuangzhou. Suddenly he woke up, and there he was, solid and unmistakable Zhuangzhou. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzhou who had dreamt he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he was Zhuangzhou. Between Zhuangzhou and the butterfly, there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things." Unquote. This is an example of one of the key themes of the text, which is that the false dichotomies and useless binaries that human beings come up with and separate the world according to, such as good and bad, awake or asleep, life and death, human and nature, I and thou, are not productive for achieving oneness with the Tao. While Confucians were arguing for duty and education and textual study and moral imperative for the greater good of society and the maintenance of individual roles and relationships to achieve the social and political ideal, Zhuangzi was much more carefree and aloof, arguing that human nature, being coextensive and indistinct from nature and the Tao itself, could naturally align with the Tao left to its own devices. This is kind of true in a lot of ways. Humans eat, sleep, poop, breathe, socialize, play, love, appreciate beauty, and much more without any culturing or any education. We have no choice but to be subject to the forces and laws of nature because we are coextensive with nature. Killing and violence is energy expensive and is avoided where possible by living things, and requires an I-thou distinction that the Zhuangzi argues is an imposition on reality that leads to self-interest and self-centeredness. This, as you can see, is a moral philosophy appealing to human nature. So when put in conversation with the Daodejing, we can see that these two texts support each other in a lot of ways. At this stage, I want to explore the opposite position. I won't give you a single text or thinker to set this discussion into, because it would take up the whole episode and draw from several texts and drop you, the listener, into the deep end of the complicated and dense world of Chinese literary history. Just understand that the opposing view has been written on. So let's say that the basis of the argument was, unlike Zhuangzi, that human nature did not naturally align with the Tao. Just for the sake of fleshing out this point in a vacuum, let's assume that the argument relies on the nature of the Tao as presented in the Daodejing, like the Zhuangzi does. There are some important implications that one can draw from that. If human nature, a phrase which literally has the word nature in it, by the way, did not align with the Tao when left to its own devices, that implies some sort of separation or distinction between nature and humanity. That was one of Zhuangzi's sticking points. He believed that that dichotomy did not hold up. I tend to agree with them to some extent, but some disagree. They say that humans must learn, study, and/or practice. In other words, naturality does not come naturally. So, how does one study and practice to align with the Tao? They read the Taoist texts I mentioned earlier, they remove themselves from cities, towns, villages, and other human encampments, and they engage in what is called religious Taoism, or a series of ascetic and medical practices whose purpose is primarily to align one's life with the Tao, but also to achieve immortality. This brings us to a discussion of religious Taoism. I mentioned earlier that the distinction between philosophical Taoism and religious Taoism is very shaky, and it's descriptive rather than prescriptive. That is mostly true in most of Chinese history, but actually, by the 15th century, there was even a pair of names to distinguish these two kinds of thought. Daojia, written with the character for Dao and the character Jia for clan, family, guild, or household, referred to philosophical Taoism. Religious Taoism was represented by Daojiao, which is written with Dao and with Jiao, the character for teaching, religious sect, doctrine, or faith. The distinction between these two names is there in the texts and leads us to have a conversation about religious and philosophical Taoism, but it's a meaningless distinction because the clan of the Tao shared the teachings of the Tao. The lineage of the Tao was where one received the doctrine of the Tao. Thus you can see that neither one of these is separate as it might be presented. Nonetheless, there are two identifiable aspects here. There is the textual and the practical. In theory, one could say that philosophical Taoism referred to that which is written down, and religious Taoism referred to that which people did with what was written down. Understand that these two are inextricably mixed. So what did religious Taoists, who had learned from and taught philosophical Taoism, actually do? Well, they engaged in practices which may be called shamanistic. They tapped into what they categorized as sacred knowledge and practice, and they sought to redress the balance of the universe through banishing or defeating unseen evil entities. They performed exorcisms for people who were sick, villages facing drought, famine, or misfortune, and they prescribed medicines and ritual practices to help as well. They also engaged in divination, making use of the I Ching, which I'll come back to in a moment. They also practiced astrology and geomancy. These shamans and diviners would often be under the employ of rulers and kings as very close spiritual advisors. We've discussed the mandate of heaven in other episodes, and remember that it refers to the right to rule ordained by the gods and spirits of the world. When you have lost the mandate due to bad rulership, they would send drought, famine, disease, civil unrest, and many more bad things to your domain in order to facilitate a revolution or at least to send the message that you no longer have the approval of the gods. Whenever you have the mandate of heaven, however, things are great and prosperous, and one of the jobs of the shaman diviner Taoists was to essentially answer the king's question: is what I'm about to do going to anger the gods and spirits or jeopardize my mandate of heaven in any way? This is a very uniquely powerful position. In a non-cynical light, one can use this position for good and gently steer the king away from stuff that would harm the people. From a cynical light, if you as the shaman diviner stood to benefit from this or that trade deal, or from knocking over this or that rival kingdom, you could steer the king to do that. In their non-political roles, they practice special kinds of internal and external alchemy, which we collectively call traditional Chinese medicine. Now that we are discussing this, I'd like to step back a moment and say that traditional Chinese medicine is not a monolithic thing that existed in history as a single textual or practical tradition. Western scholars have taken a bunch of textual sources, many of which were destroyed in the Cultural Revolution, which come from disparate times and places, and they've imposed this edifice of quote-unquote traditional Chinese medicine onto it. This has been done for the same reasons that secular Buddhism and Buddhist modernism has come about. On the one hand, Chinese thinkers want to reclaim and retake some authority over knowledge production and define themselves against Western science and Western medicine and Western knowledge in what can be called Chinese exceptionalism. By the way, this is in the exact same fashion that Americans are guilty of American exceptionalism. Another reason for the invention of traditional Chinese medicine is that Westerners love to look at Chinese stuff and see this unified mystical repository of ancient secrets and magic that the mystics of the Far East have discovered. I say all that sarcastically because it has very obvious colonial and racist overtones. So keep all of that in mind. Traditional Chinese medicine is an artifact of colorful imaginations built on racist and colonial undertones. Nevertheless, there are texts with medical stuff in them. People in ancient China were curious about the body and how it works, just like the Egyptians, the Persians, and other cultures were. One of the biggest sources we can look to for ancient Chinese medical practices is the Huangdi Neijing, or the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor. The Yellow Emperor is a Chinese folk religious figure who serves as the king of heaven and as the primordial creator of Chinese culture and people. This inner canon was compiled sometime in the period between 500 BCE and 200 BCE, and it likely had many iterations and versions. It is a series of dialogues between the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, and his ministers and physicians, Qibo and Xiaoyu. This text takes the view that human health is a situation of balance of the wuxing, the 5 elements we discussed before, and of the internal climate. Not too much hot, not too much cold, free flow of qi, which is vital energy, the stuff of life, etc., and generally living a life of balanced diet, emotions, and lifestyle. The human body is understood as being a microclimate or a microenvironment reflective of the macroclimate and the environment we live in. Everything, including foods, internal organs, emotions, the human body itself, personalities, environments, professions, have aspects of hot and cold, and have balances and combinations of the 5 elements and also of yin and yang. And health is achieved and maintained by achieving balance between all of these things. Through manipulating these balances, it was also thought that one could achieve immortality, the ability to fly, the ability to phase through walls, and the ability to duplicate oneself. However, be aware that it's not clear how much regarding the supernatural powers comes from Buddhism and how much comes originally from Daoism. The two are inextricably linked throughout history, so it's impossible to say. So you'll remember qi, or vital energy. This substance takes a vital role in traditional Chinese medicine. It's a vital energy source which has 5 main functions: actuation, or tui dong, which is actuation of all the physical processes in the body, especially the circulation of all body fluids, such as blood, in their vessels. This also includes actuation of the function of the organs and the meridians, which we'll come back to. The next function is warming, or wen shu. This refers to the function of qi as keeping all of your extremities warm. In fact, having cold extremities is a symptom of being ill in some way. The next function is defense, fang yu. This refers to defense against stuff from the outside of our bodies that would come into our bodies and make it sick, sort of like germs and bacteria as we understand medicine today. The next function is containment, or gu shi, and this refers to containment of bodily fluids. Basically, everything on the inside should stay on the inside. The last function is intertransformation, or qi hua, and it refers to transformation of food, drink, and breath into qi, blood, and other fluids in the body. And also, of course, it refers to the transformation of any one of those things into the other. I mentioned that qi flows along channels in the body, and these are called meridians. These meridians can become clogged, injured, or interrupted, causing some sort of medical problem. Oftentimes, it was said that symptoms such as pallid complexion, fatigue, weakness, sweating, slurred speech, indigestion, and shortness of breath, especially with exertion, were presentations of clogged qi or a lack of qi. This sounds like any illness that could possibly affect a human to me. But regardless, qi is believed to be generated by actions which are nourishing to the continued life of the body, such as eating, drinking, and breathing. Disease presents itself also when there is some climate imbalance within the body due to infection, lifestyle, or some other environmental factor. A medical practitioner will have to look at a person and assess their symptoms and their qi, and they'll have to decide which element is out of balance. There are 6 forces or patterns which must be held in balance. They are wind or feng, cold or han, fire or huo, dampness or shi, dryness, dao, or summer heat, shu. Imbalances of these elements present as different symptoms all over the body. For example, an imbalance of wind will cause tremors, paralysis, seizures, itching. Imbalance of cold will cause aversion to cold or relief of symptoms by warmth or abdominal pain. Imbalance of fire will cause aversion to heat or a high fever, excessive thirst, indigestion. An imbalance of dampness will cause a sensation of heaviness or bloatedness. An imbalance of dryness will cause dry mouth, dry throat, dry lips, nosebleed, dry skin. And an imbalance of summer heat will cause either mixed damp heat symptoms or heat symptoms. This one is kind of like heat or fire and dampness put together, referring to like a humid summer day. These imbalances are diagnosed by inspections of the face and tongue. Incidentally, the tongue plays a massive diagnostic role in the system for some reason. One also examines the breath, listening for wheezing or coughing or bad breath. They also smell the patient. They ask 7 ritually prescribed questions, which involve asking the person about the regularity, severity, or other characteristics of chills, fever, perspiration, appetite, thirst, taste, defecation, urination, pain, sleep, menses, or leukorrhea. Leukorrhea is the medical term for female discharge. After asking these questions and determining what the issue might be, the medical practitioner will also palpate meridian intersection points, which are now used in modern acupuncture practice. When disease would be identified by the practitioner, acupuncture treatment would be prescribed, but so too would botanic and non-botanic medicines. There are roughly 13,000 compounds used in traditional Chinese medicine and over 100,000 medical recipes recorded in the ancient literature. Most of the materials are plant extracts, but there are also many animal substances, which has led in modern times to the illegal trade and slaughter of rare and exotic animals. For example, early in the COVID pandemic, it was thought that the COVID-19 virus entered the human population at an animal market in Wuhan, where pangolins, these scaled mammals indigenous to Asia and Africa, were being sold. The reason why they were being traded is because powder made from their scales is thought in traditional Chinese medicine to be an aphrodisiac. This was eventually found to be an incorrect origin point for how the virus entered the human population, but there was and still is a huge illegal animal trade whose purpose is to support the production and sale of animal materials used in traditional Chinese medicine. Having spoken cursorily about traditional Chinese medicine, we can now speak about political Daoism. This reflects the dimension of Daoism as being a political faction, or entity, which exerted influence on legislation and policy in ancient Chinese royal courts. Political Daoism has 2 legs to stand on, and those are religious and philosophical Daoism. I say this because government officials were well versed in Daoist texts, and they often prescribed or practiced religious rituals and ascetic practices at various times in their lives at the same time as having bureaucratic and political careers. So, what was the Daoist political faction like? In general, it was very small government-oriented, in the sense that Daoists were strong opponents of legalism and of blatantly and excessively legislating aspects of people's daily lives. Rival Confucians would be more interested in cultivating education, benevolence, and ritual propriety through laws and regulations pertaining to these things, and thus might be more sympathetic to legalism. This rejection of legalism also reflects the concept of wu wei, or non-action, which basically argued that if you led by example and cultivated yourself to an extreme degree as a ruler, then the rest of society would, by extension, be good without you having to tell them to be good or threaten them with bad consequences if they aren't good. As such, they always advocated for as light of a touch as possible when it came to matters of government from the ruler. Daoists were also generally against war, invasion, and military violence, but they often bent on this issue for specific various reasons. Additionally, as much as this can be said in ancient history, where cities were not nearly as large as they are today, they favored rural and agrarian life over urban life. In all of these ways I'm describing, They were often counterpoints to the Confucians, which favored urban life, favored education in the texts and arts, favored large community rituals and urban living, favored legalism in some cases, and favored militaristic expansion. Because Taoism, Confucianism, and yet more schools of thought, like Moism and the School of Names, and many other such schools of thought existed in a big philosophical and religious soup, there were many cases where people would take a Taoist point of view on one issue and a Confucian point of view on another, and then they would write treatises with quotes from the Ma-wang-tui and influences from the Legge. Thus, it is really hard to pull the strings apart and conclusively say what the Taoist quote-unquote political platform really was, because it was contextually defined, because it was subject to individuals in history and their own agendas and positions, and it was subject to the fact that these political factions played different roles in an ancient royal court than political parties play in our modern American or Western government. We'll conclude our discussion of Taoism here for today, but join us next time, where we will be discussing the Ba Gua, the I Ching, and the 64 hexagrams. We've covered a lot of ground in not nearly as much depth as I would have liked, but I do hope to see you for that episode. I think it'll be very interesting. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.